The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless assault from a sky determined to drown the world. It was the kind of monsoon weekend that made you want to curl up with a good book, a warm blanket, and forget about the outside world. But the insistent ringing of the doorbell shattered the peaceful silence, pulling me away from the novel in my hands. It was Mark and his younger brother David. Mark's face was split into a wide grin, his excitement echoing in his voice as he announced, "We're here!" David, ever the quieter one, simply nodded, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. They were soaked to the bone, but their smiles were brighter than the lightning flashing across the sky. I ushered them inside, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. The air crackled with their youthful energy, a welcome intrusion into the quiet solitude I had been enjoying. It was going to be an interesting weekend. Mark, always one for grand entrances, threw open his jacket with a flourish, revealing a set of keys dangling from his finger. "Behold," he announced dramatically, "my new chariot awaits." It turned out chariot was a bit of an overstatement, but the sleek silver car parked outside was impressive nonetheless. David, unable to contain his excitement any longer, grabbed my arm. "We're going to see the waterfall," he exclaimed, his words tumbling out in a rush. The waterfall was a local legend, said to be especially spectacular during the monsoon season. The idea was spontaneous, maybe even a little crazy considering the weather, but the infectious enthusiasm radiating from Mark and David was impossible to resist. A night drive, the roar of the waterfall, the thrill of adventure, it was an offer I couldn't refuse. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, a wall of impenetrable darkness. The air, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, felt oppressive, suffocating. Mark's stomach, rebelling against the spicy food, churned uncomfortably. "I need to stop," said Mark. He pulled over onto the side of the road, the headlights illuminating a small clearing. "Don't wander too far," I called out, my voice barely audible above the wind. David, already half asleep, mumbled something unintelligible. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, the distant howl of a wild animal. He hurried into the trees, desperate to find some semblance of privacy. Section 5. A cry in the darkness. Relief washed over me, the discomfort in my stomach easing. As he zipped up his pants, he heard laugh, a distressed, thin, and reedy, carried on the wind. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, a desperate cry for help. I called Mark as my joint was finishing up. As Mark stood there staring at tree, a bicycle appearing first in the faint glow of the car's taillights. He was an old man, his face etched with wrinkles, his eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice trembling. "It's not safe. Leave now before it's too late." Section 6. Frozen in fear. Mark still straying at tree above, and my mind struggling to process to understand the man. I ignored him. I hesitated, torn between the urge to leave, back to the safety of the car, and the nagging feeling that something might be trouble. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a sudden chill that sent shivers down my spine. The car was shrouded in an unnatural darkness, the red glow of the taillights barely penetrating the gloom. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a cold sweat prickled my skin. I called out to Mark, my voice a strangled whisper, but he didn't react. He was transfixed, his eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. I yelled, "Mark, let's go, we will miss the sunrise at the waterfall." Section 7. Flight. This time he flinched, as if startled by a sudden noise. His eyes darted to mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, a desperate plea for help in their depths. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the fear vanished from his face, replaced by a blank, emotionless mask. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Adrenaline surged through my veins, overriding my fear. Mark spun on his heels and sprinted back towards the car. Section 8. Racing Shadows. I scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut behind me. He threw the car into gear, tires spitting gravel as we roared back onto the road, leaving the clearing and the old man's warning far behind. The forest whizzed by in a blur of green and brown, the headlights painting dancing shadows on the trees. Mark drove like a man possessed, his face pale and drawn, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. We didn't speak, but the terror in the air was thick enough to choke on. The silence was broken only by the frantic thump of our hearts and the roar of the engine as Mark pushed the car to its limits, desperate to outrun whatever horror we had stumbled upon in that clearing. Section 9. The back seat. The tension in the car was palpable. The rhythmic swoosh of the windshield wipers and the drone of the engine were the only sounds that filled the tense silence. Mark didn't dare turn around. We didn't need to. We hadn't outrun the horror. We had brought it with us. It had been in the back seat all along, a silent, unseen passenger in our desperate flight, what Mark said next morning on return to home. Section 11. Scars of the night. We made it home in the dead of night, the storm finally breaking, leaving behind an eerie silence. Stepping out of the car felt like stepping back into reality, the familiar surroundings of my home a stark contrast to the nightmare we had just endured. Mark, shaken but unharmed, left soon after, his usual exuberance replaced by a haunted silence. He doesn't talk about what happened, and neither do I, but I know he remembers. I see it in his eyes, the same terror I feel every time I close my eyes. The rain has stopped, but the storm still rages within me. I am haunted by the memory of that night, the chilling realization of what we brought back with us. I haven't stopped for a bathroom break during a night drive since. Some scars, I've learned, run deeper than the surface, etched onto the soul itself.